Following the end of the Second World War, there are a huge number of war crimes trials that saw many defendants being sentenced to death. Despite trials taking place, there were thousands of ex-concentration camp guards and workers who were responsible for atrocities that escaped justice, and there were also many more who committed atrocities on the battlefield who escaped any form of punishment. The sentence for those who were guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity was death in many cases, and hundreds of Germans went to the gallows. One of those was Erich Muhsfeldt, who was found guilty at the Auschwitz trial for his involvement in mass murder inside of Auschwitz. He was a man who participated in many other atrocities. So join us today as we look at the compelling execution of Erich Muhsfeldt, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Erich Muhsfeldt was born in February 1913, and it's assumed he had a normal early life, and joined the Nazis as Hitler came into power. In his civilian life before he became involved in the military and the war effort, he was a baker and worked inside of a bakery. He was married and had one son. However, it's believed that his wife was killed during an air raid, and his son was then sent away. He signed up to become a member of the SS and saw service as the Second World War waged on. He saw service with the German SS Sonderkommando inside of Auschwitz I in 1940. At this time, Auschwitz was only a very small concentration camp compared to what it became, as more prisoners were transferred there, and as Commandant Rudolf Höss expanded the camp to a colossal size, capable of mass murder of thousands of people on a daily basis, Muhsfeldt was there. He was then transferred to work at Majdanek concentration camp on the 15th of November 1941, and it was here where he was involved in mass murder and execution on a huge scale. He was involved in the mass murder of Jews at Majdanek, Ponitova and Travniki concentration camps. Following a number of uprisings in ghettos and extermination camps, Himmler commanded the murder of the remaining Jewish forced labourers in the district of Lublin. Thousands of SS and Gestapo personnel were transferred to Lublin to oversee the mass murder and killing, and Muhsfeldt was one of those officers sent to carry out the killings. On the 3rd of November 1943, the killings began. The operation was called Operation Harvest Festival, and at 5 a.m. on the 3rd of November, the prisoners of Majdanek were awoken, and the camp had been surrounded by 500 soldiers. Different groups were separated, and Jews were sent to the infirmary when they were trucked to a different part of the camp. Prisoners were forced to undress, and then in groups of 100, they were taken to 3 trenches in a field behind the camp. Jews were then further sorted into groups of 10, when they were led into a trench, and then execution squads of between 10 to 12 SS men were waiting. They forced the prisoners to lie down in the trench, and then they were shot in the neck. More shooting continued at Travniki and Ponitova, and over the course of 2 days, around 40,000 prisoners had been slaughtered, with almost half coming at Majdanek. Muhsfeldt was one of those men involved in the shooting, and following the liquidation of Majdanek, he returned back to Auschwitz, where he worked as a supervising SS officer of the Jewish Sonderkommando inside of Crematoria 2 and 3 at Auschwitz-Birkenau. In this he would be armed with his gun, and he would patrol over the men who were responsible for cleaning up after the gas chambers. The Sonderkommando would retrieve the bodies of those gassed to death, and would then burn them at the crematoria. Any sight of insubordination in their ranks would lead to guards such as Muhsfeldt executing them. As he returned to Auschwitz, shockingly, Muhsfeldt struck up a bizarre relationship with a Jewish-Hungarian pathologist named Mikos Niezli. He was forced to work with Josef Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death, the doctor who was responsible for horrific experiments and cruelty. Niezli would state how the two would talk, and he was one of many who told of the crimes of Auschwitz after the war. He said that during one incident, Muhsfeldt arrived to see him in the infirmary following a mass execution. He had been involved in the shooting of 80 prisoners in the back of the head before they were then cremated. It was said that his blood pressure was raised, and when asked if this was to do with the huge mass murder of new prisoners who were arriving at Auschwitz, Muhsfeldt stated, "It does not matter to me whether I shoot one person or 80. It was said that his blood pressure was high also because he drank too much. Niezli also said that when Muhsfeldt was overseeing the gas chambers, a young girl of 15 was brought to him, as she had somehow survived the gas chambers. When the girl was brought to the infirmary, she was partially recovering, and it was asked whether her life should be spared because of her ordeal. Muhsfeldt replied stating, "There's no way of getting round it. That child will have to die." After this it was said that half an hour later the girl was led, or rather carried, into a furnace room hallway, and there Muhsfeldt sent another in his place to do the job, where a bullet was placed in the back of her neck. After the end of the Second World War, Muhsfeldt was arrested and was charged by the War Crimes Group European Command. He was then handed over to Poland and was retried in Krakow as part of the Auschwitz trials. This began on the 24th of November 1947 and saw 41 former members of staff at the largest death camp being placed on trial. On trial alongside Erich Muhsfeldt was Arthur Lieber-Henschel, the camp's former commandant, Maria Mandel, an infamous female guard, and also SS Dr. Johann Kramer. The trial issued 23 different death sentences and 17 prison terms. It was said during the verdict that torturing of prisoners of Auschwitz, already tormented to the extreme by extrajudicial means, is the evidence of inhumane savagery perpetrated by those defendants who, as a result of the trial, were sentenced to death. The listed violent crimes committed by named defendants, who all took smaller or larger part in the mass murder of prisoners, also reveal that the accused were involved in the acts of killing for pleasure, and not pursuant to orders of their superiors. If it were not for their expressed desire to kill, they would have otherwise displayed elements of sympathy for the victims, or at least shown indifference to their plight, but not tortured them to death. Erich Muhsfeldt was one of those who was sentenced to death for being involved in crimes against humanity and mass murder whilst at Auschwitz. He was responsible for the slaying of thousands of victims personally, and also in disposing of their bodies and remains inside of the Crematoria. Inside of Krakow's Montelupich Prison, which was during the Second World War one of the most brutal German prisons used by the Gestapo, the hangings of those sentenced to death were carried out. The hangings conducted inside the prison were rather primitive. Inside of the execution chamber in the prison were a number of hooks. Erich Muhsfeldt would have been brought into the chamber along with a number of other convicted war criminals. He was then placed on a stool where a noose was hanged from the hook, and whilst he was stood on the stool, the noose was secured around his neck. Following this, a guard kicked out the stool from under him, and he would have slowly strangled to death, taking a number of minutes to die. The execution of Erich Muhsfeldt was one of many at the Auschwitz trial. However, only a fraction of those guards who ever worked at Auschwitz were brought to trial to face up to their crimes. He was a man who was involved in the mass murder of thousands, and had intricate knowledge about the killing process of the Holocaust, and in particular what happened at Auschwitz. He enforced the Sonderkommando, the group of men who were forced to clean up the gas chambers, and if any sign of resistance emerged, he would not have hesitated to execute and take the life of another. He was a callous murderer, and today many of his crimes remain untold. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.